You know, the video about the J36 started as a pretty normal video. But when all was done and dusted, I started having some doubts. I was very uneasy about one detail. Little I knew how this would have sent me deep into an unexpected rabbit hole.
You just Googled stuff for 2 hours, sir.
At the end of it, there was the realization that we saw for the first time a technology that has the potential to change, well, maybe not everything, but definitely quite a lot. If and only if I'm right, of course. Hi, welcome, I'm Gas, he is Otis, and this is Millennium 7. In the original J36 video...
Sponsor, sir.
What?
The sponsor segment, sir.
Oh yes, obviously. Before starting, please give some love to the sponsor of this video. So, in the original video about the J36, there was this passage. And, as if this was not enough, there are two more oddities. The first, quite obvious, is the fact that there is no visible gap between the surfaces and the main wing structure. The shadow suggests that the hinge is actually covered by a sort of a flexible coating. This arrangement is not an absolute first, but it was used so far, at the best of my knowledge, only on light aircraft, and it was never used on a combat aircraft for stealth purposes. I believe this is a relatively elegant way of managing the radar return of the mobile surfaces intersections with the main wing, which is always problematic. And that was it. Interesting technology, interesting development. At the end of the day, we don't even know whether it is really a bendable material or not. Then I started thinking, let's suppose this is true. What are the implications? And I froze because in that moment I realized I missed quite an important point in all this business. The first thing to understand is that the radiation-absorbing materials are not a futuristic or exotic technology. The first patent is Dutch and goes back to the early 30s. They are in practical use since World War II, with the Germans getting there first as usual. They adopted a form of radar-absorbing material to coat the snorkels and the periscopes of the U-boats. Rams are also quite common in civilian applications, where they are used to line anechoic chambers, which are fundamental for most radio frequency research and testing. I'm sure you have seen a picture of those rooms lined with pyramids to minimize the reflections.
I have been in one. It is very spooky. I couldn't detect any radiation.
Okay, thank you, Otis. However, aerospace stuff for military use is a different thing. It must be light, it can be bulky, it must withstand the temperatures and the challenges of the environment the aircraft travels in. It must be something else, it can be cones. And to understand what it could be, we need to understand three basic principles before. Radar reflections, but in general all the electromagnetic waves reflections, happen when there is an interface between two different mediums with different intrinsic impedance. The intrinsic impedance is a measure of how hard it is for the wave to travel inside the material. The impedance of empty space, and the atmosphere is basically the same as empty space for what we are concerned, is 377 ohms. Impedance of aluminium, which is the material that is the most used for aircraft structures today, is about 3 ohms. You understand that it is a pretty big discontinuity, hence a pretty big reflection. It is obviously much more complicated than this, and the associated math is indeed complex. But this is one of the principles that is used in rams: impedance matching. If the impedance varies smoothly from the empty space to the impedance of the underlying structure, there will be no big reflection. However, there is another principle that can be used for radar-absorbing materials, that is the quarter-wave resonators. In these systems, we accept the discontinuity and the reflections, but we use different layers of materials whose reflections are spaced by a quarter of the wavelength of the impinging radiation. In this way, the reflections will, at least partially, cancel each other out. This obviously means that there is a design frequency where the reflection cancel each other almost completely, but the attenuation gets lower if the frequency of the impinging radiation either increases or decreases. These radar-absorbing materials are heavily frequency dependent. The final key concept that we need to understand is that, like ladies like to say, size matters. Let's look at this chart. It shows the relative size of a sphere compared with the wavelength of the impinging radiation versus the radar cross-section. Without going into the details, the radar cross-section is a measure of how much radiation is reflected by an object. As you can see, if the sphere is small compared to the wavelength, the RCS is small and the reflection is weak. If the sphere is about the same size as the wavelength or larger, then the RCS is big and it converges to a set value with the decrease of the wavelength or the increase of the frequency, which is basically the same thing. The concept is objects smaller than the radiation wavelength do not reflect much. So far the concept, but what about the practical implementation? There are two main types of radar absorbers used for military aerospace applications. Those that are based on different layers of conductive and isolating materials, and those that rely on particles being dispersed in a matrix. And normally the two types are actually combined. Layered absorbers cause multiple different reflections of the impinging signal with a phase difference such that the reflections cancel each other out, at least partially. Particles-based absorbers, varying the density of the particles, cause a smooth impedance transition using the principle of impedance matching. There is an almost infinite variety of combinations of these two principles. Some are even active, that is, the property of the layer can be changed by applying voltage to the components. Or another interesting type of radar-absorbing material is the frequency-selective surface, which are used as bandpass filters for radomes. The antenna emission can go out, radiation on the same frequency of the emission can go in to an extent, but everything else is absorbed. These use various dielectric and conductive layers arranged as a grate with various geometries. And speaking of geometries, what do the three principles we have outlined before have in common? Well, that the geometry of the system matters. The distance and the thickness of the layers, the size and design of the particles and their separation, or better, their density, is an integral part of the design. Not to speak of those active designs that use small antenna loops, but, well, I'm digressing. This is the reason why it would be extremely useful for a country to recover example of the potential opponent's RAMs. Unlike software-based features, RAMs can be studied from their physical appearance. How exactly these materials are designed, their production process, what is in there, the number of layers, the materials, the shapes of the particle, and so on, is a closely guarded secret. But nobody can really hide the physics. All clear so far?
Possibly.
Okay, good. Now, the key point is, radiation-absorbing materials are tuned to a certain range of frequencies. If you change the geometry, you will change the frequencies being absorbed. But if this is the case, what happens if I bend the material? Well, to show this to you, I need some cake. This is a typical Italian Easter cake. It's called colomba de dove in English. Now imagine that the bubbles inside the cake are our particles dispersed in the matrix. If I bend the cake, the bubbles on the outside of the bending get stirred and get away from each other, while those on the inside get squeezed together. The bubble separation changes, their density changes, and if this was a radar-absorbing material, rather than a cake, the property of the material would change as well. And it is the material geometry that causes this.
With all the due respect, sir, what is this supposed to be?
Don't worry, Otis, it's just something that I filmed in Italy when I was there. It is even worse if I have two layers separated by a gap. The bending process changes the gap thickness and, again, the material properties will change. It won't cease being a RAM, but the attenuation as a function of the frequency will change, and maybe it will change enough to give away a reflection strong enough for an identification. Now, if you look at the J36, it really seems that the aircraft is covered in a RAM cladding. It is very smooth with no exposed details, and you can see the same smoothness where the outermost control surface is bent. It really seems that the cladding is bending with the underlying structure. If the Chinese managed to design a bending radar absorbing material that doesn't change its properties, how I can't tell, but if they did it, this is a very important progress. The intersection of the moving surfaces with the wing is an important reflector. There are a lot of different phenomena that go on in those areas, and they are critical to engineer for low observability. You understand that if you can just slap some gummy material on top and call it a day, your life is much easier. I don't know whether this is the case or not, nobody knows at this stage, but it seems to me that this was something worthy of being brought to your attention. Thank you to you for watching this video so far, and thank you to all those who are supporting the channel on Patreon by being a member or by any of the other means available. I am enormously grateful. And if you can support the channel financially, which is perfectly fine, do it only if you can, please interact with the video, leave a comment, hit like, or subscribe if you haven't yet. Many people who watch my video are. This is it. Thank you very much for watching, and see you next time.